Oh, hello there. I didn't notice you. I was really absorbed in this Japanese manga that I'm reading, in the original Japanese. Now, I can't actually read kanji, nor can I speak Japanese, and I've never been to Japan. But I can understand what's going on in this manga because I'm a member of a particular society, the Society of Comic Book Readers, and we speak a special language, and that language is sequential art. Now, what Will Eisner has to say about sequential art is that it's comprised of hieroglyphs, that is to say, a particular codified system of symbols which are recurrent and which have a subliminal effect upon the comic book reader. We recognize these symbols and they instantly evoke something in our minds, which helps push along the narrative. Our comics project today is on the visual elements of comics and the ways in which they affect the reader. So what I'll be focusing on is the frame, those individual boxes on individual pages that push along the narrative. Here's what Will Eisner has to say about the frame. The frame can be used to convey something of the dimensions of sound and emotional climate in which the action occurs, as well as contributing to the atmosphere of the page as a whole. The intent of the frame here is not so much to provide a stage as to heighten the reader's involvement with the narrative. So what Will's getting at here is that to not provide a stage is to not mime every single action that goes on in the narrative. Comics have to contain gaps, and this is something the reader has to infer in order to have a fluid narrative. In other words, Will Eisner again, talking about film. The number of images allowed is limited, whereas in a film the idea or emotion can be expressed by hundreds of images displayed in fluid sequence. So what Will Eisner is getting at here is that these hundreds of images have a very different effect than comic books, which is why we can't read film reels as we would a comic. It's just not enjoyable. So what I'm going to be doing today is looking at a number of examples and explaining the ways in which eye movement and narrative are portrayed through particular panel structures and through particular panel decisions. So let's look at some examples. To follow along with Will Eisner, we'll begin with a very simple analysis of simple panel outlines and simple narratives and move up to the more complex and eventually the downright weird. So what we have here is Will Eisner's Comics in Sequential Art, the beginning of the chapter on the panel outline. What Will says here is that the function of the panel outline is in service of the story it is created after. So what he means is that an artist can create a panel outline and then impose his intentionality upon it. Panel outline is very specific to the author and it's not incidental. So what we have here is a very basic skeleton upon which we'll be superimposing images. Ah, there we go. Now it's become the Amulet of Osiris, a spirit comic likewise by Will Eisner. We see now that there is content, imagery, as well as a specific narrative. The eye is drawn along the word bubbles from the upper left to the upper right, down the arrow containing the body of the woman and the man to the top of Prexy's head. And this is all done with a specific intentionality and with a specific narrative purpose, that is, to introduce the Amulet of Osiris. So we see here that these are the building blocks we'll be able to use to continue our discussion of panel structure, that the author takes their ideas, places them within frames, and then within those frames places his artwork in order to draw the reader in and create a comic book. This example is from Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. Now, we'll be getting into the function of time in comics panel structures momentarily, but for now let's just look at the fact that there are 9 panels evenly spaced out in a grid form. This is potentially done to adhere to the French style that Marjane was attempting to adhere to, but it also has the effect of drawing the eye evenly across the page. There's no gigantic focal point, and there's no point at which the reader stops and says, I wonder what's going on in this page. It's all very obvious, very narratively effective, and very straightforward. In opposition to Persepolis, we have Neil Gaiman's Sandman, a considerably more complex narrative as well as a considerably more complex panel structure. In the back we have the super panel, the elderly man getting out of his car, which frames the rest of the page and draws the eye back before letting it return to the conventional panels upon which the rest of the narrative is placed. This has the effect of slowing down eye movement, of causing the reader's eye to wander around the page, and it really draws the reader in an immersive way that Persepolis can't lay claim to. Alright, now that we've looked at a couple of examples of the ways in which artists embed their own intentionality within panel structure, and the ways in which panel structuring is intentionally chosen to portray a particular effect, we can move on to what is probably the most integral element of comic paneling, that is to say timing. Now Will Eisner spends a lot of time on timing in comics and sequential art, and he says the following. To convey timing, which is the manipulation of the events of time to achieve a specific message or emotion, panels become a crucial element. The experience is conveyed by the use of illusions and symbols and their arrangement. This harkens back to what Eisner said previously about hieroglyphics, hieroglyphics being the exclusive language spoken only by comic book readers. Now Eisner takes this one step further. He begins to talk about timing and intentional paneling in terms of Einsteinian theory and the theory of special relativity. And he says the following. In his special theory of relativity, Einstein states that time is not absolute but relative to the position of the observer. In essence, the panel or box makes that postulate a reality for the comic book reader. It establishes the position of the reader in relation to the scene and indicates the duration of the event. What Eisner is saying is essentially that comics take subjective time and they place it within a particular box, in this case a literal box, a panel. Comic book artists have to be very careful about the ways in which they use panel structure in order to convey the correct sense of timing, and in order to take their readers where they want to take them. He describes this in the following way. The number and size of panels also contribute to the story rhythm and passage of time. For example, when there is a need to compress time, a greater number of panels are used. The action then becomes more segmented, unlike the action that occurs in larger, more conventional panels. By placing panels together, we deal with rate and elapsed time in its narrowest sense. What Eisner means by rate in its narrowest sense is literally the rate at which the eye perceives these images, and artists have to be intensely careful about the ways in which they do this in order to convey the correct sense of narrative, as well as to establish the correct dramatic timing. Our first example, and a recent favorite of mine, is Jim Starlin, Bernie Wrightson, and Bill Ray's Batman run, entitled The Cult. Now these guys must have read comics and sequential art, because the idea of segmented time, as well as specific panel structures denoting that time, comes up numerous times in their work. Will Eisner spends quite a lot of time in his book dealing with the idea of beats, staccatos, and rhythms in comics, all musical terms. Adhering to this musical terminology, the concept of a metronome also comes up multiple times in comics and sequential art. We see it in this particular page on those 6 panels at the bottom, the ones denoting a drop of rain falling from the roof of the sewer into the gutter. The effect given here then is the same as the one Will Eisner describes in his book. It slows down time. It forces the eye of the reader to travel slowly over the subject matter, which exaggerates the sense of time that Batman spends in the sewer, as well as exaggerating his isolation. Combined with the super panel, as well as the 4 panels along the top, which are likewise narrow, this is a truly effective utilization of timing in comics, creating a subjective simulation of time, as well as a true engagement with the text for the reader. Perhaps in opposition to The Cult in more ways than one, Loeb, Lee, and Williams' infamous Batman run, Hush, likewise portrays time in a very dynamic and effective fashion. In the top panel here, which is essentially a splash page unto itself, we see an annihilation of the necessity for panels. We see about 16 Harley Quinns being chased by about 16 Catwomen, and the effect is one of disorientation, but also one of extreme speed. The reader really gets the sense that this is fast-paced combat, perhaps even faster than the human eye can follow. However, upon the termination of the chase scene, that is to say the 3 vertical panels at the bottom of the page, the action is once again slowed down to a halt, as Harley Quinn discharges her gun and hits Catwoman, and then thrashes through the bottom of the stage production. To put it in Eisner's terms, the effect of these 4 panels then is one of interrupted motion, of a fluid rhythm established by the top panel, which is then interrupted by the 3 on the bottom. This intimate connection between form and content, of the feelings invoked within the reader upon having read this page of Hush, forms the thesis of both this presentation as well as comics and sequential art. That is to say, there is an intimate bond intentionally placed within the comic by the author and the writer, which evokes certain emotions within the reader. That is to say, the visuals affect the viewer in a truly dynamic experience that can only truly be portrayed through comics. So we've covered the basics of panel construction, as well as those comics that use timing in a specific way to elicit a specific response from the reader. Now it's time to get weird. Now it's time to talk about those panel constructions who are either so complex or so unconventional that they have a disorienting effect on the reader. And this disorienting effect can either be intentional, or, as in the case of one of our examples, a natural consequence of attempting to fit far too much onto one page. Esteemed Canadian artist Ken Steezy, upon visiting our lecture hall, commented on the ability of form to override content at times, providing a sensory overload which potentially obscures the intended narrative. Here are some examples, both of when it works and it doesn't. For our first example of unconventional panel structuring, we have Jonan Vasquez's fan favorite, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. Now this is one of those panels Ken Steezy was referring to when he was talking about form overcoming content. The page is laid out more or less in a pinwheel shape, and the eye is immediately drawn to the center, which is effective in terms of the content, but not so much in terms of the form. The eye is then drawn around the sides to a series of incredibly dark jokes. The intention of this page then is to portray a series of simultaneous, horrible acts with darkly comedic consequences. Time and narrative are both annihilated, lending the work a sense of intense destabilization. Since this is the point, this panel is a success. The final page we'll be looking at is the only one of the group which I truly consider to be a failure, and it is from Hush. It is what Ken Steezy would refer to as form-enveloping content. Like many pages from Hush, it features a super panel as well as smaller additional panels explaining specific actions. The problem with this page is that these smaller specific panels don't appear to have any particular order, at least not to a Western reader. The eye is immediately drawn to the word bubbles, and the reader is not sure where to begin. And once the reader does determine where to begin, the word bubbles ultimately run in a circular pattern, confusing the eye movement. Though chock full of content, the arrangement of this page makes the deciphering of this content a difficult task for the reader, and in this sense at least, this page is a failure. Form and content in this instance seem to be divorced. with each exhibiting a distinct presence, but neither exhibiting any sort of symbiosis with the other. Having considered the basics of panel construction, as well as the intricacies of portraying time in a static medium, it becomes apparent that panel construction is not an incidental maneuver on the part of the artist. As important as form and content, and an amalgamation of both, one cannot help but conclude that panel construction is an essential element in the unique expression of comics, and perhaps comprises the backbone of the reader's own subjective experience of sequential art.